We are going to be taking a look at how African American leadership and political power has evolved and changed over time, from American slavery to American presidency. My name is Adam Evans, and I will be talking about where black male leadership began in the United States. Outlets for leadership as a black man in the U.S. were mostly non-existent during slavery. For hundreds of years, slaves lived under constant fear of torture by their masters. As Daniel Black says in a historical and literary analysis of the legacy of slavery titled Dismantling Black Manhood, enslaved African Americans, especially men, knew that, at some point in their lives, they would meet the whip. It was to be expected. They need not do anything wrong to merit the captor's lash upon their backs. They only needed to be black and enslaved, and most African American men of the era met these qualifications. End quote. Slave conditioning used the most brutal methods of human control to a point where many slaves even believed in the system that they were victims of. It was not until August 22, 1831, that Americans saw the first semi-successful slave rebellion. Nat Turner led about 70 other slaves in an effort to kill slave-holding whites in Southampton County, Virginia, starting with the plantation that he resided on. His efforts were short-lived, but word of his rebellion spread quickly around the country and sparked a lot of controversy over the issue of slavery in the South. The North became increasingly more involved in the abolitionist movement as word of the condition of slavery spread through the country. Much of this news came by way of slaves who escaped and fled north and other rebellion efforts, and eventually led to the Civil War and emancipation. Despite the fact of having almost no rights, the idea of being a free man sparked a lot of inspiration in former slaves and opened many doors to opportunity for development of leadership and their masculinity. However, these outlets were very limited. Holding positions of military or political power was out of the question for African Americans during Reconstruction, and voting in elections was nearly impossible even after the 15th Amendment in 1870. These restraints on life did not stop black leadership from evolving, but forced it to choose alternative routes for gaining power in the community. Education was naturally embraced as an outlet for building ideas, feeding curiosities, developing masculinity, and gaining power. Even though education was very limited and poorly funded early on for African Americans in most places, some were able to embrace it and use it to rise to power. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are two of the most notable in the early years post-Civil War, but chose drastically different paths in their movements. Washington was born a slave a few years before the Civil War and grew up with very little in Alabama and focused his life on education, eventually building his own school and gaining national recognition for his achievements. Washington's push for slow integration and his cooperation with white leaders gained him the reputation as Safe Negro and appointed him as the voice of his race. His non-offensive, step-by-step approach to civil rights was strategic and reflective of the environment that he grew up in as a slave and in poverty in the South. Du Bois felt very differently about education and integration and criticized Washington for his methods. Du Bois wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and nothing less. He saw Washington's efforts as feeding into the white man's ideas of African Americans only being good for labor and wanted to give everyone an opportunity at a scholarly lifestyle. This path was also effective and reflective of the environment that he grew up in. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts and raised in a relatively tolerant community. He also focused his life on education and civil rights, and graduated from Harvard with the first African American doctorate degree. His scholarly success led him to organize many civil rights efforts, such as the NAACP and the Niagara Movement, and also influenced politicians. In his open letter to President Woodrow Wilson, Du Bois reminds him that his history in the South and current position as incoming president gives him a unique chance and responsibility to focus on the much-needed changes in the federal government. The other main outlet for leadership and gaining power in the community was religion. Churches at the time were a place where a black man could hold a position of power in his community, gain control, and make executive decisions. During Reconstruction, churches emphasized healthcare and personal hygiene. They taught how to prevent and treat diseases that had been detrimental to African Americans during slavery, when medical treatment was unavailable. They also offered a safe communal experience to socialize comfortably and be respected while sharing beliefs and ideas. It educated spiritually and morally and promoted growth. Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association was largely based around religion. Garvey taught about Christianity and emphasized Jesus Christ's divine spotless soul as a living example to man. Garvey's organization fought for preservation of race and building an all-black community with an end goal of landing in Africa to reclaim the continent. Needless to say, his ideas rustled a few feathers with the government, rendering him as a threat. In the height of Garvey's glory, he would hold conventions in Harlem that were part social events and part religious sermons. These events grew steadily, eventually attracting thousands that would march down the street in UNIA uniforms. At this point, Garveyism is seen as black militancy and a serious threat to the American way of life. Things went downhill from there for Garvey and the UNIA. He had surpassed the sweet spot of building a movement for people of African descent in the United States while not becoming a target of the government. He made a few bad business decisions and was arrested on a creative mail fraud charge, leaving his movement to crumble. But his legacy inspired many movements to follow.
In the departure of Garvey, due to exile, a new religious movement was gaining traction in the United States. Elijah Muhammad, born Elijah Poole in Sandersville, Georgia, was exposed to the ministry from a very young age. It was many years before he would break away from Christianity completely, and ironically, it was William Poole, his father, who introduced him to the Nation of Islam. In 1931, Elijah attended his first Islamic meeting and met its leader, Wallace D. Farrard. He became fully immersed in the movement, abandoning his slave owner's surname. He was initially called Kareem and then later Muhammad, and then within the same year he became Farrard's top assistant. With the growth of the nation, more scrutiny fell on Farrard as the leader. In 1933, in an attempt to remove himself from the negative spotlight, Farrard named Muhammad supreme minister, and when Farrard disappeared the following year, Muhammad succeeded him as head of the Nation of Islam. After relocating to Chicago, Illinois, the Nation of Islam thrived under Muhammad's leadership, embracing the technology of the Western culture as opposed to his predecessor, Farrard. He believed in order for black separation to succeed, total economic independence was crucial. The nation acquired a number of businesses during the late 1940s and 50s, initially a restaurant, a bakery, and a farm. When Muhammad returned to Chicago in 1942, after leaving for Milwaukee and the East Coast because of death threats, he was quickly arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and indicted for draft evasion and sedition. He and a number of followers went to prison in 1943 for refusing to fight in World War II. The structure and the ritual of the nation appealed to many poor blacks, particularly convicts in jail. One of those recruited from prison was a young named Muhammad Malcolm Little. Born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, he had joined the nation while in a Massachusetts prison for larceny in the late 1940s. In 1950, he was transferred to Charleston State Prison, where he began corresponding with the NOI's leader, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. After being released in 1952, Malcolm visited Muhammad at the nation's headquarters in Chicago, where Malcolm took on the surname X, as did most of the organization's members. In 1954, he was appointed by Muhammad to lead Mosaic No. 7 in Harlem, and with newly established position, Malcolm X traveled throughout the country speaking on behalf of the Nation of Islam and setting up new mosaics. In 1959, a television documentary entitled The Hate That Hate Produced portrayed the Nation of Islam as a racist organization bent on destroying white America. Even with such a negative tone, the film attracted thousands of blacks who appreciated separatism, moral code, and economic initiative of the Muslims. The organization's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, was created by Malcolm X in 1961 and was filled with an alternative, more militant message than one being put forth by the civil rights leaders of the time. In an interview, Muhammad comments on how this newspaper is used to voice the attitudes of the nation by stating, "You'll find that on the last page of Muhammad Speaks newspaper, where we have learned that we cannot get along with the white man in peace, and the white man has the privilege to separate us, the more we want to be separated from him, the more he wants to gobble us up, and excuse the word gobble, but the more he wants to swallow us up in his power. He don't want the black man out of his sight. He's afraid of you going for yourself, but this is the only way he could exist. Now, because those days of separatism have come divinely." By the year 1963, Malcolm X had become the most prominent leader of the nation, being coveted to appear on television and radio shows, along with speeches throughout America and the rest of the world. In the same year, he was questioned by a reporter regarding the assassination of President Kennedy and recalled the political violence carried out by the Kennedy administration. After this occurrence, he was publicly suspended from the nation for 90 days by Muhammad himself. The public suspension also carried an ulterior motive. It was Muhammad's way of undermining Malcolm's growing threat to his personal wealth and leadership of the organization. The next year, Malcolm X departed from the Nation of Islam for conflicting ideological visions and jealousy among the organization's leadership. By the end of 1964 and early 1965, editorials were appearing in Muhammad Speaks describing Malcolm X as worthy of death, and on February 21st, 1965, he was gunned down by an assassin as he spoke at the Abu Dhabi Ballroom in Manhattan. An article for the Los Angeles Times referred to this conflict and his death, stating, "The simple fact of the matter is Malcolm X, at the time he died, was deeply involved in a power struggle for what might well be the profitable leadership of an extremist Negro movement. By his own testimony, he expected to fall victim to his competitors within that movement. Without a nurtured hatred, Malcolm could not have thrived. Without it, he would not be dead." The investigation of his death would later become inconclusive after rumors of FBI involvement in his assassination became mainstream information, even though facts suggest the NOI was responsible for the shooting. Many people admired the uncompromising attitude and militancy of Malcolm X, and his assassination spurred the creation of the Black Panther Party for self-defense to continue organizing to defend the rights of black people. The Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland, California by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in October of 1966. The two crafted the demands of the Black Panther Party in a 10-point platform that demanded, among other items, full employment, exemption of black from military service, and an end to police brutality. The Black Panther Party's combined of socialism and black nationalism, insisting that the community should take over the means of production if business and the government did not provide for full employment, and the organization also promoted the development of strong black-controlled institutions. The Encyclopedia of the African American Experience states, "The party first attracted attention in May 1967 when it protested a bill to outlaw carrying loaded weapons in the public. Reporters quickly gathered around the contingent of protesters who had marched on the California State Capitol in Sacramento, armed with weapons and wearing the party's distinctive black leather jackets and black berets. After Seale read a statement, police arrested him and 30 others. News coverage of the incident attracted news recruits and led to the formation of the chapters outside the San Francisco Bay Area." Newton was convicted of murder, and during this time, the time of his case became a calling card, with the Panthers and others shouting "Free Huey" at rallies. His conviction was overturned, and he returned to the party with dramatically increased audience size. Crusader newspaper from the Chicago contained an excerpt of Newton's attorney that stated, "The attorney for the Black Panther founder, Huey P. Newton, called his murder trial a diabolical attempt to put an innocent man in jail or in the gas chamber." Defense attorney Charles Gary said that case was an outgrowth of discrimination. Racial tensions by this time had reached a volatile point, and the Federal Bureau of Investigations blamed Black Panther Party for riots and other incidents of violence. The Bureau launched a program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, designed to disrupt efforts to unify black militant groups. Newton himself was extremely aware of the FBI's tactics and how successfully they were in infiltrating the Black Panther Party. A quote from Newton in reference to the paid informant William O'Neill states, "During the period from 1960 to 1970, O'Neill received over $17,000 from the FBI. In return, he provided the FBI with almost daily information concerning the activities and in particular the leadership of the party. He became the chief of secretary for the Black Panther Party in 1969. O'Neill became Hampton's personal bodyguard." This signified the success of the FBI and the mission to dismantle the organization. Further research of declassified FBI files also confirms the involvement of the government in these destructive affairs. One document inside the Black Panther Party file expressly states, "When an opportunity to disrupt or neutralize black nationalist, hate-type organizations through the cooperation of established local news media contacts or through such contact with sources available to the beat of the government. In every instance, careful attention must be given to the proposal to ensure that the targeted group is disrupted, ridiculed, or discredited through the publicity and not merely publicized." Other civil rights leaders and organizations of the time deferred an ideology from both groups who were seen by the white general public as radicals. One of these organizations was the NAACP and its leader Roy Wilkins, who took over in March of 1955. Wilkins pressured the national government to pass legislation that would end discrimination. While he worked primarily by lobbying politicians in conversations with presidents, Wilkins also took to the streets to participate in protests, including the March on Washington and the Selma March. Author Frederick O. Sargent summarizes Wilkins' contribution to the civil rights movement in the following excerpt. Wilkins was widely regarded as Mr. Civil Rights. The civil rights legislation that Wilkins helped to obtain included the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Wilkins was awarded the NAACP Spingarr Medal in 1964. He received 50 honorary degrees. He retired in 1977 after 46 years with the NAACP. The organizational competition between the NAACP and SCLC was intensified by a personal rivalry between NAACP leader Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King Jr. The public perception of Reverend Dr. King rested on his reputation as an advocate for nonviolence, but he was also worried that many African-American activists did not share his personal commitment to non-resistance. His approach to change relied on the violent reactions of white supremacists to nonviolent protesters to put pressure on the public and government officials. The Chicago Daily Tribune quoted King's sentiment towards more militant approaches for gaining equality in the statement. "Violence never won any permanent benefit," he said. "Never try to get rid of the segregationists, only segregation. If America is to remain a first-class nation," he said, "it can no longer have second-class citizens." Moderate civil rights organizations such as the NAACP focused their attention on political alliances with the Johnson administration, while more radical and younger organizations such as SNCC were fed up with dealing with the resistant white establishment. The sentiment of this time period can be further exemplified in the following excerpt from the Western Journal of Black Studies. The advent of the Black Power movement polarized young African Americans against a historically conservative civil rights organization that, by the end of the 1960s, could no longer connect with the majority of African American youth, many of whom had been disillusioned with the promise of integration and had drifted into the Black Power movement. In many ways, King was the one leader who embodied the middle ground in a movement that was rapidly drifting apart by the mid-1960s. He was very troubled about the slogan's implications of revolutionary violence and separatism, but he also recognized that it expressed deep-seated anger and irritation of many African Americans.
As the end of the civil rights movement gave way to the 1970s and 1980s, a different kind of rhetoric took hold in the civil rights activism for Black leaders. Following the Civil Rights Act of 1964, racism could no longer formally exist on paper. However, eliminating race on paper and in practice are two different things. A rising trend then in American politics was one of inclusion and colorblindness. Laws using race-neutral language were passed, but still had a greater impact on the African American community. Furthermore, the rate of violent crime had doubled in the United States from 1969 to 1980. A public outcry demanding stricter enforcement of law and order came after the characteristically proactive and perceived militancy of Black male leaders and organizations such as the Black Panther Party. The role of leadership began to evolve. Similar to groups that encouraged interracial assimilation, collaboration, and support, Black political hopefuls began changing tactics to appeal to these larger, more diverse groups, and some embodied the same tough-on-crime persona that was prevalent in mainstream American politics. This practice, coined deracialization, is a strategy for African American leaders to become transracial leaders. To do this, Blacks played out aspects of race in order to appeal to a more diverse and broad constituency. Parallel to the end of the civil rights movement, a new leader was becoming a force in the African American community in the political arena. Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. was born in Greenville, South Carolina in 1941. In 1960, he transferred to the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina, where he became involved with civil rights protests and rallies. Just 4 years later, he traveled to Selma, Alabama, where he marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and later worked for King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Association. By the 1980s, Jackson was well established as a political and civil rights leader. In 1983, the National Black Leadership Roundtable held meetings and announced that 80% of their members supported the idea of a Black presidential candidate. They then became one of the first organizations to help organize and mobilize his first presidential campaign for the 1984 elections. As the main leader during this post-civil rights era, Jackson was subject to harsh critique by the Black community. The Chicago Metro News, an African-American newspaper, accused Jackson of being a professional at lumping the civil rights of innocent, unprotected Black people with his personal ambitions. Jackson had recently been accused of using events in the Black community for his personal benefit after claiming that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had died in his arms. Others who were present at the hotel with Jackson and King later contested this. These accusations of usurping public turmoil for personal success did not stop him from being the first viable African American presidential candidate. Jackson's first presidential campaign preserved an Afrocentric rhetoric, which renounced Western leadership as the only viable option for the American people. In being the first candidate with potential to win a Democratic Party nomination, media perception for Jackson's campaigns were different. During his first campaign, Jackson maintained much of the rhetoric surrounding the elevation and equality for blacks in the United States. In newspapers and magazines with more affluent readership, Jackson was more likely to be portrayed based on his capability, but readers of these publications were also exposed to more negative evaluations of Jackson. Many in the African American community were skeptical of Jackson being chosen as the leader for the entire black population after the Civil Rights Movement. Unsurprisingly, Jackson then switched to the practice of deracialization for his second presidential campaign in 1988. Jackson did this in order to establish himself as a well-rounded politician, not only as a black leader. The unspoken agreement in politics, both in policies as the war on drugs began and for political campaigns, shied away from race as a cornerstone. Robert T. Starks argues that after the Nixon era, most African Americans who have served in high-level executive branch positions have viewed themselves as leaders of America who just happen to be black. After another unsuccessful campaign, Jackson turned to positions in the legislative branch, where he was able to return to more Afrocentric ideologies as a candidate for shadow senator for the District of Columbia. Here, Jackson believed he would better be able to represent African Americans in a Congress where there were, at the time, no black senators. Legislative offices in the federal government allow office holders to be better connected with constituents. This availability has become increasingly beneficial in the digital age, where access to social media helps to better connect citizens with their elected representatives, as well as grassroots activist groups. This switch may have been best for Jackson, as black organizations often manifest an oppositional stance to establish national black leaders. However, Jackson is more accessible than ever and has over 82,700 followers on Twitter. Here, he continues in his place as a black political leader while also promoting his organization, Rainbow Push Coalition, which works to make the American dream a reality for all citizens and advocate for peace and justice around the world. Social media has been essential in mobilizing contemporary social justice groups. Most notably for African Americans today is Black Lives Matter. The movement Black Lives Matter began with a hashtag, a phrase identifier used on social media and accentuated by the pound symbol. Alicia Garza coined the phrase on Facebook as a love letter to black people after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. The movement has since been seen in large protests around the nation circling the lack of value for black life in American society. The hashtag Black Lives Matter was seen at protests in Ferguson, Missouri, following the death of Michael Brown, the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Maryland, and the death of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. The Black Lives Matter movement is different from the Civil Rights Movement in a few ways, but most notably is its cornerstone of grassroots organizing. The organization promotes mobilization through social media and its local chapters. The movement describes itself as not being leaderless, as criticized, but leaderful. Black Lives Matter believes that by rallying behind one or a few cisgender males, black progress leaves black women and black LGBT citizens behind. Interestingly, like Barbara Reynolds mentioned with Jesse Jackson, the media often assigns a leader over the black community. DeRay McKesson, an activist from Baltimore, Maryland, grew in popularity on social media after he attended the Ferguson protests and documented them online. McKesson has appeared on CNN and the Colbert Report to talk about systemic racism in America. In article headlines, McKesson is often referred to as a Black Lives Matter leader, even though he was initially unaffiliated with the organization. McKesson is now a candidate to be the mayor of Baltimore, Maryland. McKesson has support from Silicon Valley, as well as support from his large social media base. Despite changes in leadership, moving from select leaders to a larger base grassroots system, black male leadership still is prevalent and highlighted in mainstream media and politics.